morning everyone. Today we will discuss globalization. This is session 2 of the course Global Trade and Commerce. What is globalization? Everybody wants to know what has happened to globalization in recent years, the concept of gated globalization, examples of gated globalization, the way forward for the global economy, and examples of globalization which have been a success so far. So today's topic is globalization and the changing political regimes. Now, what is globalization? All of us hear the word globalization so often. It's a buzzword. It's been a buzzword for the last 3 or 4 decades. When most countries went in for the economic reforms process, they wanted to integrate themselves with the global economy, and this is when the concept of globalization became very, very popular. So basically, it's a process of interaction and integration among countries, companies, peoples, governments of different nations. It's a process that is driven by international trade and commerce, investment, and these days it is aided by information technology. So information technology in today's time is the driving force of globalization. Now this process of globalization has tremendous effects on environment, on culture, on political systems, on economic development and prosperity, and on human physical well-being in societies around the world. So globalization has become very, very important and integral part of our lives today. What are the causes of globalization? Why do you think countries went in for this process of globalization? First is that transportation networks have increased tremendously. Global travel has been made easier. Containerization, it is a rapid adoption of steel transport containers for transport of goods via sea and oceans, which has made trade transaction costs come down tremendously. Trade has become more efficient and cheaper as well, and therefore containerization is also one important reason why globalization has taken off in a big way. Improved technology, as I said, globalization is aided and driven by technology today. The growth of multinational companies, transnational corporations, and of course the mushrooming of global trading blocks like the comprehensive trade trans-Pacific partnership, the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, the various free trade agreements that countries have signed amongst themselves. So these are some of the reasons why globalization has taken off in a big way. The effort at globalization has also been made by the global media. There's increased mobility of labor between countries. There's internet enabled global communication. Reducing of trade barriers between countries also aided globalization, and the financial system in the global economy has become much more integrated. Given the fact that there has been globalization on the one hand, at the same time we see in tandem we see the growth of protectionism in many nations across the world. So there has been a rise in protectionism, especially in the last 1 decade or so, and in the last 4 or 5 years protectionist tendencies among countries has become more and more rampant, and we see that mostly in the continent of Europe and the United States. So when you talk about the theory of international trade, there are 2 types of trade policies. One is the liberalized trade policy and the other is the protectionist trade policies. Liberalized trade policies is nothing but laissez-faire, where there is less interference of the government in the affairs of the people. And the second, as I told you, is the protectionist policies, where countries kind of trade with each other by imposing heavier tariffs, more tariffs. There is increase in non-tariff measures like phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, environmental clearance has become much tougher. Countries impose more regulations on each other's traded products. So they become more protectionist, they start looking inwards. So basically protectionism consists of economic policies that restrict trade between countries, whereas liberalized trade policies lead to global integration. So most of the time protectionist policies stem from an urge to improve the well-being of domestic manufacturers, domestic industry, by making them more competitive in comparison to imported goods. So basically it's kind of protecting your own domestic economy that countries become more and more protectionist. Now, as I told you, there are different types of policies that governments adopt to resort to protectionism. One is, of course, increasing import tariffs on imported goods, which makes the local goods more attractive than the imported goods. countries put all types of administrative barriers like excessive government regulations to place huge burdens on foreign imports, making it difficult for them to sell in the domestic market. They increase domestic subsidies, they increase import quotas, that is, they put a restriction on the amount of good that can be imported to a country. Then, exchange rates, they make their exchange rates they allow their exchange rates to depreciate in a manner that the cost of imports and lower the cost of exports and increase the cost of imports. So these are some of the popular protectionist policies that most countries resort to. From globalization, we see that, as I told you, countries have become more protectionist, they have become more cautious, and therefore the concept of globalization has now transformed itself to become what is called as gated globalization. It's the buzzword these days, everybody talks about gated globalization. So what is gated globalization? It doesn't mean that globalization has been abandoned across the world. It is just that nations have become a little more protectionist. They have entered into a more cautious and restricted phase after the global economic crisis of 2007-8. Now, countries have become very selective with whom they trade with. They have begun to strengthen their local domestic businesses and industries and promoting self-sufficiency, and this has kind of promoted gated globalization. Although it protects countries from contagion and makes economic crisis less damaging, at the same time it discourages competition and traps capital in countries. So this is one of the greatest drawbacks of gated globalization. So let me give you an example of gated globalization. One very important example of gated globalization is, of course, the Brexit. What is Brexit? It is basically the withdrawal of Britain from the European Union, which happened in the year 2016 in the month of June, wherein UK withdrew from the European Union through a nationwide referendum where the British people voted for an exit from the European Union. And this is a classic example of a gated globalization where anti-immigration policies are rampant, where nationalist sentiments are running very high. People want to protect themselves, they want to protect their local jobs, the domestic economy, and they feel that the outsiders are taking away everything, and therefore they resort to protectionism and gated globalization, and Brexit is a classic example of that. This Brexit would have large scale implications for not only India but also the global economy, especially the developing countries, with whom Britain has very good relations. Brexit has also resulted in financial markets volatility across the world and could spur a number of other risks through various trade, finance and confidence channels. The weakness of the European economy could also get exposed because of Brexit. It would hurt world exports as weakening European currencies might put renewed downward pressure on major exporting countries. So this is what has happened because of gated globalization. And there are other significant impacts of Brexit as well. It could have implications on the India-European Union trade. India-EU trade is now nearly $115 billion, and this could kind of get affected because of Brexit. Bilateral trade with the Britain is likely to increase post-Brexit. We'll have to wait and watch. Currently, the trade between India and Britain is around $25 billion. And India is no longer dependent on the EU and Britain as much as it used to earlier. Now we trade with a lot more emerging economies like China and the UAE and the Middle East, and therefore we are unlikely to get much affected by Brexit. So basically, because of all these reasons, the countries have become more protectionist. We see that nowadays global recession or the global slowdown is a very, very common phenomenon. What is a global recession or a global slowdown? The International Monetary Fund defines a global recession as a decline in annual per capita real world GDP, backed by a declining or worsening of for one or more of the 7 global macroeconomic indicators, such as industrial production, trade, consumption, unemployment, per capita investment and per capita consumption. So we see that the global recession has kind of increased because of the pandemic. The corona pandemic has really put the global economy in a mess. Nearly 200 million people could end up without work due to the pandemic. A total of 81% of the global workforce of 3.3 billion people have had their workplace fully or partially closed. So we definitely are in a global recession because of the pandemic, and the world has really changed. The IMF has revised revised its figures, the world economic outlook, and projects very, very negative growth for the world economy. So basically, can you say that the corona pandemic is the turning point for globalization? Yes, it is. The world now faces a stark choice. Now we need to have a good leadership from the US to kind of promote globalization. But however, the engine of growth lies in Asia. It is India and China which will continue to be the growth engines of the world economy. There is very much hope for globalization, and globalization is here to stay. Thank you very much.